Far out in the eastern Pacific Ocean sits a lonely ring of coral, a desolate speck barely visible on a map. This is Clipperton Island, a place so barren and inhospitable that it's hard to imagine anyone could have ever lived there, let alone endured years of suffering and tragedy. But in the early 20th century, a small group of Mexican families were sent here to establish a colony, unaware that their attempt at survival would end in one of the most harrowing tales of isolation, starvation, tyranny, and eventual rescue in modern history. The island's story begins long before these colonists ever set foot there. It's believed that Ferdinand Magellan may have been the first European to pass by the spot in 1521, but the island's confirmed discovery came in 1711, when an English privateer named John Clipperton stumbled across it during his raids against Spanish ships. The island was later given his name, although it is more of an atoll, a ring-shaped coral reef enclosing a shallow lagoon, covering just 3.5 square miles, around 9 square kilometers. Clipperton looks insignificant, but it has long fascinated explorers and governments. At its center is a stagnant freshwater lagoon, choked with algae and unsuitable for fish or drinking. Surrounding the lagoon, little vegetation grows besides a few coconut palms and creeping plants. The island is infested with thousands of toxic crabs which feed on algae and make human life even more difficult. Seabirds cover every surface, leaving behind a suffocating stench of ammonia from centuries of droppings. The few edible resources, fish offshore, coconuts, and seabird eggs, are difficult to obtain consistently. And perhaps worst of all, Clipperton lies in utter isolation, more than 600 miles from the Mexican coast, the nearest land. For centuries, the island was little more than a navigational curiosity, but in the 19th century, it became coveted territory. The reason? Guano, bird and bat droppings that, when dried, made one of the world's best fertilizers. In the mid-1800s, the discovery that guano enriched soil and boosted crop yields created a global rush for islands rich in the resource. So valuable was guano that the United States even passed the Guano Islands Act of 1856, allowing American companies to claim unoccupied islands loaded with it. Clipperton was covered in guano, and soon, nations competed for ownership. At different times, France, Mexico, Britain, and the United States all staked claims. France briefly sent a naval force in 1858 to announce sovereignty. Later, American companies arrived to mine guano, only to be driven out when Mexico reasserted control in 1897. Even Britain, then the greatest naval power on Earth, eyed Clipperton for its resources. By the early 1900s, tensions between nations made it clear whoever could permanently settle the island would have the strongest claim. And so, in 1906, Mexico dispatched a small garrison of soldiers and their families, led by Captain Ramon Arnaud, a 33-year-old officer who had fallen out of favor with the army after deserting his post. Rather than serving more prison time, Ramon was sent to Clipperton as both punishment and responsibility. He would govern the settlement while finishing his sentence. Later that year, Mexico built a lighthouse to solidify its claim. Its keeper, Victoriano Alvarez, joined the colony. Soon, British settlers and workers also tried to build homes and grow food, and for a time the population grew to nearly 100 people. But the international guano market collapsed, and the British withdrew, leaving only the Mexican colonists behind. Meanwhile, ownership of Clipperton was still unresolved. France and Mexico agreed to let the King of Italy serve as arbitrator. But just as he began reviewing the case, the Mexican Revolution erupted in 1910. Mexico became consumed by chaos, and the tiny outpost on Clipperton slipped further and further from the minds of officials on the mainland. For the colonists, this neglect was catastrophic. They had relied on monthly supply ships from Mexico, bringing food, medicine, and materials. But in 1911, the deliveries abruptly stopped. The settlers didn't know why. In truth, one of the supply ships had been sunk by rebels during the Revolution, and no replacement was ever sent. Suddenly, the 26 remaining inhabitants of Clipperton were on their own. At first, they rationed supplies and relied on what they could gather: coconuts, seabird eggs, and fish caught offshore. Pigs introduced earlier thrived by eating the toxic crabs, and the colonists hunted them for food. But with no fresh vegetables or fruits, their diet was dangerously limited. Slowly, symptoms of scurvy appeared. Gums bled, sores refused to heal, and bodies wasted away. One by one, settlers grew weaker. 3 years passed with no sign of rescue. Then, in 1914, an American ship wrecked nearby, and its crew briefly came ashore. A rescue vessel later arrived, and its captain informed Ramon about the revolution in Mexico, and even offered to evacuate the colonists, but Ramon hesitated. He had been exiled here for desertion, and leaving again might brand him a double deserter with severe punishment awaiting him back home. Fearful of disgrace, Ramon refused. The only family allowed to leave was the last, British one. The Americans left some supplies and sailed away. It was a fateful decision. Those few extra rations were soon exhausted, and the colony spiraled deeper into malnutrition and despair. By 1915, only a handful of gaunt survivors remained, hallucinating from hunger and sickness. That year, Ramon spotted a ship on the horizon. Desperate, he and 3 remaining soldiers launched a small boat to try to reach it. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say the ship was a hallucination and the men drowned after capsizing. Others claim the tides overturned their craft. Either way, Ramon and the last of his soldiers perished, leaving their wives widowed and helpless. As if this weren't enough, soon after their deaths, a hurricane struck the island. The women and children sheltered in a basement while winds destroyed their homes and uprooted the precious coconut palms. Amid the storm, Ramon's pregnant wife, Alicia, went into labor and gave birth to a baby boy. By the time the hurricane passed, the colony was reduced to rubble. Now only women and children remained, and one man, Victoriano Alvarez, the reclusive lighthouse keeper. Emerging from isolation, Alvarez declared himself the king of Clipperton. He confiscated weapons, threw them into the sea, and announced that the women were now his property. For nearly 3 years he ruled by terror, subjecting the women to brutal violence, enslavement, and repeated assaults. He beat them for defiance, forced them into his hut one by one, and murdered anyone who resisted, including a mother and her teenage daughter. The women endured this nightmare until July 1917, when Alvarez finally went too far. He declared that Alicia, the widow of Ramon and mother of a newborn, would be his next victim. To the other women, Alicia was like a protector, a maternal figure. They could not allow Alvarez to touch her. That night, Tirza Rendon, a 20-year-old who had long defied Alvarez, convinced the others it was time to act. At dawn, when Alicia approached Alvarez's hut as ordered, Tirza accompanied her. Alvarez grew furious at her presence, but before he could react, Tirza slipped into the lighthouse, grabbed a hammer, and returned. As Alvarez turned, she struck him in the head with all her strength. Alicia's young son rushed forward with Alvarez's discarded rifle. Wounded but still moving, Alvarez tried to grab an axe, but Tirza delivered more crushing blows before finishing him with a knife. The so-called king was dead. Exhausted and bloodied, the women collapsed in relief. For the first time in years, they were free. Then, almost unbelievably, salvation appeared on the horizon that very same day. The U.S. Navy gunboat Yorktown, searching for German submarines during World War I, spotted the island and sent sailors ashore. At first, rough tides prevented landing, but eventually, they reached the desperate women and children. Hearing their story, the sailors were horrified. Alvarez's body was left for the crabs while the survivors gathered what little they wanted to keep. On July 22, 1917, the Yorktown carried 11 survivors, 4 women and 7 children, to Mexico, where family members awaited them. The physical toll was shocking. Alicia, only 29, looked decades older. Malnutrition had stunted the children, and one was crippled by rickets. Yet despite their suffering, they were finally safe. The Navy crew even collected money among themselves to help the survivors start new lives. When the Yorktown docked, Alicia reunited with her father, who had spent years pleading with authorities for information. Officials had long told him the colonists were dead. Instead, he now embraced his daughter and 4 grandchildren. Out of compassion, the Navy's official report omitted details of Alvarez's reign of terror to protect the women from scandal. For nearly 2 decades, no one spoke publicly of his crimes or of the women's role in his death. Only much later did the full truth emerge. As for Clipperton, arbitration finally concluded in 1931, when the King of Italy awarded ownership to France. Mexico did not challenge the decision. Despite occasional shipwrecks and stranded fishermen, no country has ever again attempted to colonize the island. It remains uninhabited, a scar in the Pacific, haunted by its tragic history. The story of Clipperton Island is not just about survival in isolation. It's about how human cruelty can thrive in desperation, and how courage, even from the most powerless, can end a nightmare. For 6 long years, this forgotten colony endured starvation, storms, and the rise of a tyrant, until a small group of women, against all odds, freed themselves